it's easy to talk about the things that'll scare you from the decision, but like you should equally talk about the potential upside. And I think you just got to like get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I've made a lot of mistakes in my career. Getting comfortable being uncomfortable has never been one of them.
Hey, welcome to the show. I'm your host, Andrew Kaplan. And in this show, I chat with people who lead cross-functional growth teams about the hardest moments of their career. My guest today is Mike Rome. Mike runs a one-person growth studio called Moonwater, where he offers fractional CMO, CGO, and advisory services for 7- and 8-figure startups that want to grow faster and more profitably. Our conversation touched on a lot of interesting moments in Mike's career that started with him working at an ad agency and getting fired 6 months in, to eventually becoming CMO for a 7-figure startup where he realized that he was no longer the right person for the job and left. We also touched on Mike's decision to leave the startup world and build his own business at Moonwater. And of course, we covered a lot of the bumps, bruises, and mistakes along the way. We covered a lot of good ground in this conversation. Let's jump right in. Where I think we could start, which would be interesting, is a little bit about your journey. I feel like you've developed a cool brand for having a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge in the growth space. How did you get here? Like, how did you first get started in this world?
I feel like it was a lot of zigging when other people were zagging. So the brief overview is graduated college, 2010, studied business, always loved math. I got into marketing right away, but it was for like an ad agency. It wasn't in the startup space, but I got a taste for some of like growth side of marketing and the growth side of product. And it was interesting. And I did that for a little bit, kind of a crazy story. Ended up getting into management consulting. You know, I was young, impressionable. People told me it would be a good place to go to learn some stuff. And it totally was. But I learned pretty quick. I was kind of a fish out of water in that scene. But I started to like accumulate these skills that I didn't know at the time, but like were very applicable to the growth space as it relates to startups. And yeah, just started like networking like crazy and met some investors and founders. And eventually a few years into my career, there's like a Series A company who took a shot on me and kind of been in the space ever since. And that was like 13 years ago.
What was the agency that you worked at? I don't know if you and I have talked about this, but my journey started at a big ad agency.
I was actually at a small ad agency. I went from a small ad agency to a big management consultancy. And so actually I hooked up with these guys. In college, everyone's like junior, senior year, get an internship. It's like the first time where you like really have to like get your life together. And so yeah, I thought I might want to work at an ad agency just because like culturally, I knew I wouldn't last in like very stiff environments. And so I had this hypothesis that it was like, they seem kind of fun and all that good stuff. And so I just like applied to a bunch and got a few interviews. And I think I got a couple offers, but actually like my junior year of college, I forgot about this, but this one agency, small like boutique agency in Chicago, that's where I'm from. I interned with them summer after junior year. And it went pretty well. And they were like, hey, do you want to stay on for like 10 hours during college? And that was awesome because it was like, not great money, but for like a college kid and all the other jobs around campus, like doing 10 hours a week remote. Keep in mind, this was like 2012, like remote work, decent pay, for sure, I'll do it. And it actually went really well doing that most of senior year. And so I decided to stay there when I actually graduated. But the wheels fell off like that summer. And that's how I ended up in management consulting.
So it's really interesting. So I graduated, when did I graduate? 2008. So a couple of years before I graduated, there was like no jobs. I was interviewing, couldn't find a job. Eventually I got an interview at this random ad agency and I took it because being a marketing major, like I'm sure you saw the same things. I was in the school of business. All my friends that were in finance and accounting, they all were being recruited like fresh out of school. Like a lot of my buddies already had jobs lined up in like October, their senior year. And I was out there hustling like October after senior year. Like, I'd already been out of school a couple of months. And so that's cool that you found it early.
It's interesting now that I think about it. I didn't have as many of those words because this was kind of like a fallback thing. Like, even though it was like good as an intern and then like during senior year, I didn't think I was going to do it. And I probably applied to a few places. This is a long time ago. I'm starting to like test my memory. And for whatever reason, I think I had like one other offer, but it wasn't like this like incredible offer where it like made sense to leave. Like I knew this thing and, I knew there'd be some balance and stuff like that. And being like the first job out of school, it was like, well, I know what I'm getting into. And so I just kind of stuck around there and the guys they were pretty cool. So yeah, it's definitely commonplace, I feel like, for marketing majors to end up. But I had roommates who were like finance guys too and doing investment banking and getting recruited out in New York. So, I know that feeling, especially being like a young, impressionable kid.
And the agency world is tough, man. Like, yes, a first job, Certainly not as tough as some of those people who went into iBanking and things like that, but not an easy first career.
It's definitely a little bit of a weed out program, right? Where you grind pretty hard, just like so money. And I think they have like, that the whole like fun environment was sort of like this crutch to sort of mask some of the other like downsides of it. Totally. But when you're like 21
Yeah, the
and
grind.
you don't really have many responsibilities, it's like, yeah, it seems like a reasonable trade off. If you don't think that you're going to like fit into one of these very traditional sort of like white collar, like stiffer career paths.
A few years later, I was working at HubSpot. It was at a big agency that actually had a Chicago office, big Boston office, big Chicago office. I used to go out there a bunch, which is why I was asking you. But after that, I worked at HubSpot and I gave a talk because I was in Toastmasters there. So my first talk was called Mad Men versus
Nice.
Ad Men, what it's really like working at a big ad agency.
Oh,
Or excuse me, Madman versus Sad Man, excuse me. And that was my talk. And it was like, hey, I thought it would be ad men, but really I was sad, tired, and like
that's
over
awesome.
it. You
So
know what
like,
I mean? So I
I
remember those
imagine
days
that you were
fondly.
at HubSpot pretty early days. I'm curious,
I
like
was, yeah.
at that time, I
Yeah,
mean, I don't even know
2011.
what revenue was at that time. Obviously, like we can look at the company it is today. Was there any sort of feeling like this is going to be massive or like, what was it like in 2011?
We kind of knew. We would talk about, the company was scaling. They had just closed their Series C. And I was employee like 200. And so on paper, like not super early, but probably half the company had been hired within the last months. And so they had just really got something, figured out how to sell it, figured out how to market it, had this huge audience because their marketing was on fire, created this category, dominated it in the early days. And there was a lot of fun stuff when you worked at HubSpot. They wrote a book about it, but all the startup stuff was happening. And so, we'd go to all the happy hours and things, and we would talk about it. We'd be like, hey, I think we might have a chance to be one of those companies that other people talk about later. And it's like the management team was really good and the leadership was really solid. And they would put it up on a board. They would be like, look, we want to IPO in a couple of years and we want to be one of the top 2% software. Looked at that board and was like, look, if you're early here, there's a lot of upside for everybody. So like, let's work those off, have a little fun along. We had an idea, but we didn't really know. Like we thought
It's
we
cool
knew,
you
but
talk
I was
about just
25
like
at the
the
time. What did I
vibe
really know?
and that feeling. I mean, I've worked on a bunch of startups now and 100%, like the ones that crush, like there was a vibe and you could just kind of feel it. People running together, high energy, fast, intense culture, but respectful. And, like you say, strong leadership. And yeah, it doesn't surprise me that you got that feeling reasonably early on.
So let's go back to you. So you work at an agency, you're there, you're grinding, you decide it's not for you. Tell us a little bit more about management consulting. And I think the way you just said it was like, you were there for a little bit, but it wasn't
Yeah.
really the
So
right vibe,
actually,
wasn't
I
really
guess
the
even
right
to
fit. Tell us
take
a
a
little bit
step
more.
back, I was at that ad agency interning throughout my senior year, went through the summer after. One of the reasons I went there, just remember this, was my now wife, at the time girlfriend, they were going to let me like travel Europe for 6 or 7 weeks with her. And so that was like a huge perk, finishing school, doing that, and then going there. And I think that was probably like the reason I really took that job. So anyway, I was only there for maybe like a couple of months after senior year, after that trip. And I actually got fired. I've made plenty of mistakes in my career, some things I wish I did differently. At the time, I thought this was maybe one of those things that was my fault, but it turned out it was just like a difficult management situation where I had two bosses and pleasing one sort of upset the other. And it was a little bit of a lose-lose. But even before I took that management consulting job, I remember, there was kind of like this debate at work and I confronted these guys and was like, if I do what one of you wants, the other one's upset. And it was pretty wild.
Sorry to interrupt. So you saw this at the time. Like you saw mom and dad were fighting kind
Yeah.
of a thing?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're giving me a little too much credit. I mean, I think like some of the stuff that was happening it was kind of obvious. But the thing I did wrong being like young and dumb is I shot a note over email to both of them. So it wasn't in person. And so it wasn't like a me email or anything like that, but it's just like tough to deliver stuff like that. And again, at the time, I didn't know much. And the next morning they called me and told me not to come in anymore.
Whoa. What was the email? What did you say?
I'm sure I've sent some emails I regret in my career, but that wasn't one of them. But I remember like that morning and I was still living at home. It was like a couple of months out of school. I was saving some money. I remember like going for like a long run or like a bike ride and just thinking to myself, I mean, keep in mind, this is like my first legitimate post-college career experience. And I was just like, I'm 0 for 1. I'm like 2 months in, I'm 0 for 1. I was like, I'm not going to last. Like, I just wasn't meant for the working world, right?
And this is like when work is such a huge part of your identity and like your place in the social hierarchy with your friends. Like friends will be like, "Oh, what are you doing for?" "I'm so busy at work." "Oh, I'm so busy at work too." And you almost like wore it like a badge. So I can only imagine.
Like, up until that point in my life, I performed very well. And so this was like the first time where I knew it was just like a total punch in the face, you know? So long story short, I didn't know it at the time, but it was like a blessing in disguise. And then one thing I've always been good at in my career, I've made a lot of leaps and I've never been afraid to like hustle and network like crazy. And so that's kind of how I got into management consulting. You kind of have to test into some of those roles. I always did pretty good at that stuff though. So it wasn't an issue. So like I probably was out of work for like 4 to 6 weeks. And then I took a job at a big management consulting firm like that fall. So yeah, I was there for a couple of years. Job was cool. I kind of mentioned what I studied in college and a lot of that job was using lots of math and data to inform direction for products and brands. And, how do you tell a story? How do you kind of win people over? I love that.
And are you traveling around? Is this like, you're wearing sport jackets in the conference room Monday through Thursday night type?
I mean, pretty classic management consulting. Yeah, like Tuesday through Thursday, lots of travel. I was working on a couple of clients, really large, like Fortune 100 companies at the time. And so, yeah, I was in those offices a lot. And then, yeah, I remember I was on a work trip, this is probably like a year and a half in, and I was out east and on site with a client. And one of the guys who was like showing me around, he was like 20 years ahead of me in my career. Super nice guy, really smart. And he was like hosting me at the office. And gosh, I was probably with him for like 4 hours going in and out of meetings. And he was showing me around. And he probably said like 6 times, like, oh, just like can't wait to the weekend sort of thing. That was the time where I was just like, I saw myself in 20 years, and it was like, on the one hand, there was like this super defined career path. I mean, coming from an ad agency to management consulting, being young, was making good money. And I knew exactly what I needed to do over the next like 10 years to get to the top. And on paper, there was a lot to love about it, but I just couldn't handle that statement. I remember going home to the hotel that night and I called one of my best buddies who, super sharp guy, he's an accountant and he sort of thrives in that environment. The reason I called him was like, I thought if I could convince him, I should leave because he liked that environment. He liked that culture.
You almost needed like permission to feel the way that you felt. Is that kind of what you're
For
saying?
sure, right? It's like you're young, you don't know much. I'd like to think I didn't care, but it was a really nice thing to be able to say the name of this company to family or friends. And like everyone knew what it was. And they were like, that's a legit job. And so I knew there'd be those like repercussions. And so, yeah, I convinced him like, yeah, you should go. And I had some weird stuff going on like personally at the time. And yeah, just decided like it was going to be my time to leave. I love this phrase, execute like hell and hope you get lucky. Even though I knew new management consulting wasn't for me, I worked really hard at it. And I remember going and telling my boss the next week, and I was ready for them to just say like leave, but I also like wanted to tell them I'm happy to hang, like we can make this a transition. I didn't have anything at the time. I know that sounds crazy. Part of it was just being young and dumb, but the other part of it is like I've never been a fan of plan Bs because I think when you have them, you fall back on them. And I knew if like I was out of a job, it would like be super motivating to go find one I loved, and I already gotten this like good job. And so it was a little bit of like a confidence boost where I was like, I don't know what's ahead and all this stuff. So knowing all that, I told my boss, the other thing too, is that I would have felt bad not telling them. And then like, if they wanted me to hang, being able to hang, like it just seemed like the right thing to do. And I execute like hell, hope you get lucky. I mean, I worked hard for almost 2 years and they were kind of like, okay, no problem. Can you like hang for 3 or 4 months? We'll let you like work remote and you can work less. We'll pay you the same. And I think it only ended up being like 2 months, but they like did this awesome thing for me. And I just got super lucky. I kind of spent half the week transitioning out of management consulting and then like half the week just hustling, trying to meet people in startups. And that's how I got my first real growth experience. But I didn't know anything about startups. Like the whole hypothesis was culturally management consulting. That was the thing that wasn't great for me. I like to think of any job has hard things, right? And it's sort of like, what's the stuff you can't live without? What's the stuff you'll deal with? And then like, what's the stuff you're just not going to tolerate? And for me, it was like, I just knew culturally it wasn't for me. So my whole hypothesis was like these earlier stage companies, I was like using math and data to inform product and brand direction. I thought the skill set could be applicable. And culturally, I thought it could be like the polar opposite. So I just started reaching out to founders and VCs who were doing interesting stuff. that's probably when I figured out like what the term VC even meant. And I didn't have any experience with the space. And I guess it was because even though I wanted a job, I wasn't in a rush because I wanted to find the right thing. I didn't want to make that same mistake again. And I guess I had a little bit of a pillow transitioning out there, but I only reached out to like VCs and founders who I was like excited about. It wasn't just like sending canned emails off to, and it was like, hey, I read this thing about your fund. That's really cool because of X. I'd love to learn from you. And that was another thing at the time, like my hit rate on like getting founders and VCs who had no business talking to a 23-year-old kid, like my conversion rate on like calls was like 30% or something goofy. I didn't realize it at the time, but I think the reason it was is because I didn't ask any of them for a job. Like keep in mind, I was leaving a job that I knew wasn't for me. Before that, I was fired. As much as I like wanted to figure out what was next, I didn't want to make the same mistake again. And so I ended all of those emails with like, I'll meet you anywhere. And I'd just like to learn from you because I really genuinely wanted to know, was my hypothesis right? Were these companies different culturally and could they use my skill set? And I think it was like one of those things where I didn't know it at the time, but like turns out everyone's asking these people for jobs. And they saw this one guy who was like, I just want to learn from you. And they were like, well, this is a breath of fresh air. Yeah, I'll go talk to this kid for 10 minutes. So I met a few of them and one thing led to another and got a gig.
Can we go back a little bit? I talk to folks all the time as a coach. Some of them work at cool companies and they're scared to leave because of that employer brand FOMO. And you mentioned it earlier in our combo. You were saying it was hard for me to do this because everybody who I mentioned the company's name, they all knew it and they thought it was cool and it was a part of my identity. And so I talk to folks all the time that work at cool tech startups, and we were talking about HubSpot and things like that. They work at probably the HubSpots of today and they're miserable and they have misalignment in their values and they're working their tails off and they're working for first-time managers that don't treat them well. And they're scared to leave. They're scared to walk away, not because they're scared to figure out how to find their next job. They're scared because they have this really cool part of their identity that is tied to these neat brands. And I'm curious to know, what would your advice be to someone who's listening, who's in a situation like that? Because you had the same situation and did something different. And I'm curious what it was that helped do that.
I thought a fair amount about that in my life. And I feel like if you do have the luxury of doing it, this is just a little bit how I'm wired, but like, I almost feel like you have an obligation to do it. And one thing that I think helped me was everyone talks about the fear and the downside of leaving, right? Like the uncertainty, the conversation you have to have with your uncle or your mom or your friend or whatever. But like very few people talk about the upside. It's like, it's easy to focus on the downside. And I think that was something that I was just like conscious of pretty early on, where it was like, yes, there's all these hard things, but like, I also know all this other stuff. Like, I don't want to be that guy 20 years from now, right? Like if I do that, I just feel like I won't be fulfilling my career potential. And I think one of the things that works for me then that I think is like super important in startups is just, you kind of have to have a brutal honesty. I think about the 3 or 4 times I did big things in my career and they all scared the shit out of me. And so whenever I get that feeling, and I'm not like terribly impulsive, like I like to sit with that. But whenever I get that feeling, like I have to kind of study my own history, right? Like I think if you're willing to commit, and that's why I don't like plan Bs, because you really have to commit. You can't half-ass it. It usually means you're onto something. I know it's cliche, life's short. I know a lot of people like, might not be in that position, but yeah, I think you should try to do things in your life, keep your burn rate low, all that good stuff. So you have a little bit of flexibility to take a shot. Yeah, I think the biggest piece of advice is like, it's easy to talk about the things that'll scare you from the decision, but like you should equally talk about the potential upside. And I think you just got to like get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I've made a lot of mistakes in my career. Getting comfortable being uncomfortable has never been one of them.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, and so you mentioned a couple of these big moments in your career. Is that one of them?
That was one of them for sure. It was just super empowering because I didn't know anyone in tech. And a couple months later, I got a job. And so it was just like this really empowering experience where like I could figure some stuff out, right? Like just like a great founder, I could will some stuff into existence. And so it was super empowering and just like big sort of boost for confidence, even though then I got into startups and I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And so, yeah, I've had a couple other nodes. Happy to get into them later if you want, but that was one of the early ones for sure.
This episode is brought to you by Novatic. We're seeing the next phase of product-led growth emerge right now. The first phase of PLG was all about using your product as a go-to-market tool. basically creating free plans, free trials, or reverse free trials, getting new accounts to sign up, and then layering in retention and upgrade programs. It was a solid playbook. The only challenge is that the product value is hidden behind your sign-up form, which means that most of your visitors never get to see it. The next phase of PLG is all about leading with product value, creating interactive product demos, embedding them on your website, and letting people play with them, click around, and see the value before signing up. This engages way more people, which means more experience that value, more convert to your paid plans, and more become brand advocates. If you're sold on the idea, but not sure where to start, check out Novatic. Their no-code editor makes it easy to create interactive demos, and they're offering a free trial exclusively for delivering value listeners. Go to novatic.com/value and sign up for a free trial and see for yourself. This episode of the show is brought to you by AppQues. If you work in product-led growth, you know how important activating and engaging new accounts is. Helping those new accounts get set up, experiencing the value quickly, and then continuing to engage them deeper is super important to your success in a product-led environment. My team spent years focused on this when I was leading growth teams in-house, and I know how hard it can be. And it's why I'm so excited that AppQues is sponsoring the show. They're the leading product onboarding and adoption platform for web and mobile apps. And they created the Product Adoption Academy, which is where you can go get a free masterclass, think courses, templates, examples, etc., to help you level up your product chops. And if you haven't already, check out my Value First onboarding course in the Academy, where I share the exact framework my teams created that helped us onboard and activate hundreds of thousands of new users during my time at Wistia. Check out the Academy at appqs.com/product-adoption-academy or my personal Value First onboarding course at appqs.com/value. Love it. Okay, so had this big moment. I'd actually love to hear what they are now. I mean, so as you progress in your career, you only get a couple of these, right? These big swings. And that's kind of when you learn a lot about yourself and you learn a lot about the world that you work in and all of that. And so I'd love to know one or two others if you're willing to share them.
So worked at a startup for a couple of years. Like I said, they were just kind of Series A, post product market fit, but earlier stage stuff. And that's when I really got introduced to like this idea of growth at the intersection of like marketing, product, and I'm largely a marketing and product guy, but even a little bit sales, right? I can keep things simple. The type of companies I work on, they tend to grow high level those three ways: marketing, sales, and product. Yeah, that's when I started to really get a taste of growth. But I did it for a few years and worked for a company that was doing pretty well at the time. I got an opportunity to go work at a VC. I wanted to see how deals got done because that whole hypothesis of like, hey, I should leave management consulting, get into startups because culturally it's better fit. It was totally true for me. So I was like, I'm going to spend my career here. Maybe I'll go see how deals get done. It seems like this is how a lot of startups are financed, right? Through venture capital. And so I went to VC for a couple of years. And then sort of the next big jump for me was after being there for a couple of years, I decided I want to go back to operating. So that was like a cool, cushy job. You were in venture. You could talk about you're in a fund. But I was like, I want to go back to being an operator. And so in theory, it would have been easier just to kind of stay at the fund instead of like go all in on one company and have all that skin in the game. And so that was sort of the second one, taking the leap from VC to a Series C company at the time, and went in as their VP of growth. And then the last time where I took a leap was I stayed at that company for about 5 years, ended up becoming the CMO. We went from 7 figures to about 55 million in rev, pretty decent run over 5 years. If you had told me 10 years earlier, I'd be the CMO of a post Series C company that had a couple hundred employees and, I was just like quite respected and all that good stuff, I would have been like, this is, if I could do that by 50, that would be incredible. I couldn't ask for anything else in my career. You know how it goes. And yeah, I just had kind of gotten this itch to like, I think I need to leave. And ultimately that led me to building my own company, after, it's a little bit of a story in and of itself, but yeah, that was a huge leap for me too. Right.
Yeah. So I want to hear that story, but I actually would love to hear how it felt when you got there. Because what I have found to be true in my career is when I, on paper, got the promotion or the title that I always had as like my goal and my ambition, felt horrible when I actually got it, or it felt hollow and it didn't feel fulfilling. And I felt embarrassed almost that it didn't feel good because I always had all these goals and it was like, well, I've been working so hard to get to this thing and now I have this thing and I don't even like it. It feels icky. Does any of that resonate with you?
100%. One thing I would say is it's also a tale as old as time, right? Like I had read that story 100 times before I had gotten to like C-suite for a pretty legitimate company. But some things you just got to learn the hard way, You can read that stuff, but, I still think there's some things you just got to learn for yourself. And I will say, even though I agree with like your sentiment, it was empowering in the sense that like I kind of made a commitment to myself. Then going forward, I wouldn't think as much about the destination. Everyone tells you, you got to enjoy the ride. But that was the first time where I really felt it, where I was like, okay, I don't know what the next 20, 30 years of my career are going to feel like, but I'm going to focus on the inputs that make me excited and see what happens.
Love that. And so what happens next?
I threw out some numbers about that startup. It got to like mid 8 figs, and that sounds cool. I think the reality is like we just for 5 years got really good at finding ways not to die. It was hard. It sounds glamorous, but it wasn't. And I was just tired. You know how startups are. I used to like joke with friends. It's always like doggy years. So like 5 years at a startup is 7 for a dog, 30 plus years.
Totally. Well, and even when the company's doing well, it's like the mountain just gets taller. It's not like the goals get less. Like the bigger we are, well, we'll take our foot off the gas. It's like the bigger you get, the harder you push on the gas.
Especially when you're a venture. There's a lot of moving targets. And, if you think about how funds make money, I mean, they just need these ridiculous outsized returns, and it comes from a few companies. And so their incentive is to really push everyone to get there. And no, that's not their fault. And to be clear, like I'm not anti-VC or anything like that. I just think you should know what you're signing up for. Right. And so, yeah, I was weathered. It had been 5 years. That was half of it. And the other half was I finally came to terms with this idea that like I was no longer the best person for the job. So yeah, those two things were enough for me to say, I want to think about doing what's next. And this was like November, December 2021. So tech economy is still popping off pretty nicely. And kind of first time in my career where I had options, like I was being recruited. So yeah, I ended up taking a chief growth officer role with a Series B company, pretty flush with cash, I think about 50 million bucks.
You just said something that I've never heard before. So you said, I realized that I was no longer the best person for the job. Can you share what caused you to come to that conclusion?
Yeah, I think it goes back to some of that brutal honesty. That wasn't the only reason I left. I'm not like that admirable. The other part of it, I was like tired, right? So my trajectory at this startup, when I left VC to go in, I came on as their VP of growth. And so I was splitting time building a cross-functional growth team, like designers, developers. We had a data scientist and we had like a growth marketer, sort of doubled as a PM. And so I spent half my time like, okay, once we get people to these assets we have, how do we get them to do what we want, right? Activation. How do we get them to continue to do what we want? Retention. How do we get them to engage in more monetization behavior? Stuff like that, like very much like early days product-led growth stuff. Then I was spending the other half of my time leveling up their digital marketing apparatus. That was sort of like the twofold job. And then about 2.5 years in, they said, hey, do you want to be the CMO? And you'll get out of this product work. You'll still own like all the growth marketing, but in addition to growth marketing, you'll have a creative team, you'll have a brand team, you'll have an on-the-ground marketing team. It's a consumer startup. So I think I said that in the beginning. I do more consumer than like B2B SaaS. I do about 80% consumer. So I was like, yeah, that sounds cool. It would be a total education. Like, even though I was like a growth and a math guy, I got really into this idea. I had a boss a few jobs earlier who, when a couple of hard things happened, he told me like, think of this as like you're getting paid to get a great education. And that was something that totally stuck out with me, like during hard times. Instead of being like, this is shitty, someone got fired, like how management did something. If you could flip it and say, I'm making 60, 80, 100, whatever, K to learn this lesson, that was always like really interesting. And so I carry that with me. And so I was like, I don't know as much about brand and creative, but there were some people on my team who like I knew I could count on, who were like under me, but really qualified for that job. And they had like the skills for that job, and I could cultivate them in a way. And so I was like, yeah, like I'll get a promotion, I'll get paid to get an education and really understand marketing holistically. And so I took it. And so I did it for about 2.5 years. It was that, total awesome education. But yeah, I think it was like the startup was growing well. And all of a sudden I had a team of like 20 people. I wasn't executing the work. I'm always someone who's loved to like plan and do, strategy and execution. And I'd gotten out of that. All of these other things that I was grateful to learn. It was wonderful, but like, it wasn't what I wanted to do long term, lots of meetings. And again, I just had one of those times where I was just like, this was a cool run. And this didn't all come to me at once, right? Like it was a lot of like leaning on mentors and time thinking, but I kind of made peace with this idea of like, it's somebody else's turn, right? Like the playbook to go from A to B and then B to C and then C onward, they're all different. And a lot of people are afraid to admit that like they can't be great at all of them. But like, I think if you do, it's a total career unlock. Keep in mind, I was 10 years into my career at this point. This wasn't something figured out quickly, but I think it's a total unlock if you can make peace with you're no longer the best person for the job and what are you the best person for? And hopefully you can love doing it. And then you go and bet your career on that thing.
It wasn't so much that anything was wrong or broken or you felt like you weren't succeeding. You felt like you had gotten a lot of the learnings from this experience. You had gotten paid to learn all these new things. And part of that learning was you realizing what you like to do best. And so you realized what that was, and it was time to go focus on that. Is that fair? I'm paraphrasing what I heard you say.
100%. And I think one thing in there too is I did decide to go a little earlier after that. Like I said, it was the first time in my career where like I had options, and most people, it wasn't their fault. They didn't know me. They were telling me to go later. Like, okay, you took a company from 7 figs to 50 million. Now go take one from 50 to 100. Or maybe even instead of being the number one, go be the number two at a company that's doing 250 million and they're on path for 5. And again, nothing wrong with those career paths. They're incredible opportunities for people. But I was at a point where I was far enough along in my career to have some conviction and be like, I don't want to do that. And I also think there's someone more qualified to do that. But I think there's this thing going earlier, getting more focused on growth again, that I'm one of the best people for that role. And it gives me energy. That was a lot of talking with mentors, and it took me about 9 months to make peace with that. Because again, especially like I hadn't had options like this before, so like that made things even harder. And I'm thankful. I think there's like something in me where like, hopefully it's become clear now where I don't mind zigging when some people zag, if I feel like it's a good bet on myself and something that gets me excited.
Cool. So you have this amazing experience. You get all these learnings from it, and then you identify what it is that you want to do next. So you left and you went and became, I think you were saying, chief growth officer at another earlier stage company.
It was earlier stage than where I was at, but definitely post product market fit. I think they might've been doing around 15 million in rev, and given my last experience, having seen a company get past there, they were trying to go at the next step. It was a great startup on paper. I mean, they were crushing. And when it came to marketing and products, I don't mean this in a condescending way. They were succeeding in spite of themselves. It wasn't because they were doing the wrong things. It was just, it was earlier stage. There was lots of duct tape under the hood. You know how it goes. And they had finally they'd raised some capital and they were like, we can focus on this stuff. And so again, it wasn't like someone did a bad job. It just, they hadn't really focused on this idea of like, how do we level up growth? And knowing that, those are my favorite opportunities. It's like, if they had like Uber's growth team iterating on growth for 3 years and had gotten to where they got, that wouldn't have been nearly as interesting, right? Because there was just so much upside. And so, so I went there, and I think like the too long didn't read on that was I let a good offer really cloud my judgment. I was also tired from the last job. And so I took it, and it was about 6 weeks in, and this was like January 2022, economy still popping off. Culturally, there was just some real red flags. So I consulted with like 3 mentors. It was like, hey, should I stick this thing out? Here's what's happening. All 3 of them I thought would be like, yeah, stick it out 6 months. And they were all like, to my surprise, get the heck out of there. And so I've got 2 boys. My youngest, he's fine, but he's got a heart condition. So long story short, my wife wasn't working at the time. And so we kind of made this deal where if I could get close to matching my income, I could build my own thing. I've been getting kind of requests to advise for the last year and a half, and I never thought I was going to start something. I started it out of necessity, but it was like the first time in my career where I was like, I think I can do this. I had this tailwind of the economy, and I know I can't stay here long term. In fairness to me and also to the company, like I didn't want them to waste their time on me. They should find someone else who's a better fit for the business. I made that decision and sold for like 3 weeks, booked a full load, and bought myself like 6 months of runway to keep figuring it out. So that's how my own company, Moonwater, was born.
So I want to hear a little bit more about this, because I also talk to folks who are in that. Maybe they're a year in, 6 months in. At some point, they realize, hey, I'm not in the right place. I maybe should start my own thing, but I'm scared to. And so I just want to detangle how you approached it a little bit. So you had a conversation with your family. You decided that you would need a few months worth of runway before you made this leap. And so did you start promoting yourself during this time when you're still in-house? Did you leave and then really hit the ground running in terms of promoting yourself? Like, how did you actually get started? What were the first couple of steps?
I've always been someone who believed in playing the long game. And I feel like this interview, it sounds like I hop around a lot, but I just gave you the story of like, including management consulting, 15 years. So there was companies I was at for 3 or 4 years. And then the company that I was a CMO at, I was almost there for 6. And so I had a lot of reps, and having been, at the time, I guess it's like 11 years into startups, 13 years into my career, and knowing that I was like always mindful of playing the long game, like I had a pretty good network and I had a lot of people I'd done solids for and never really asked for anything in return. And so never did any sort of like self promotion before that, like LinkedIn writing. I've done a lot of that in the last 2 years, but up until this point, I hadn't done any. And so at the time, I had so much energy to channel into leaving. Like I got to this place in my career where I was just like, it felt like I had some clout. And I was like, this was the wrong decision, but like there's an opportunity to seize here. And so I put all that energy into just networking like crazy. And so basically what I did was I just made a list of like 100 people, like people I was close to, people I'd helped out in the past in startups. Some were VCs, some were operators, some were founders and CEOs, and some were just like really good connectors. I was like, hey, I've been getting some requests to advise. I think I'm going to give it a shot. If you know anyone who might be interested, here's like a 1-page PDF that's like the problems I solve, how I solved them, and like some of the wins I've stacked. And there might have been one or two other things on there, but it was literally a page. Thankfully, like I had investors who had been part of boards I was on and saw what I could do. And some people like introed me to other people. And like I said, the economy was still good. Execute like hell, hope you get lucky sort of thing. Good tailwind there. And yeah, it only took me like 3 weeks to book a full-time load for 6 months. So, and for me and my wife, that was enough time to be like, okay, in 6 months, I can keep figuring this thing out. And at that time, I didn't know if I wanted to keep building my own thing or like, maybe I would just do this. Then maybe I'd find another company I want to go all in on, right? It was sort of like this grand experiment.
Could have been a bridge plan. Maybe would have found one and ended up going in-house. Did you send that email when you were still employed, or had you given your notice or left at that
This
point?
was a little bit different than my management consulting days because I had a family. My wife wasn't working. And so, yes, sucked it up and didn't let that company know I was leaving until I had a full load of gigs lined up. And I was also super transparent with the companies that were interested in working with me, saying like, hey, I'm not going to leave till I have like a full load. So I was like really upfront with them about that. And no one seemed to care. If this company wanted me to stay, I knew they were going to be pissed, right? I'd been there for 6 weeks. But if they wanted me to stay, I'd built in a pillow where, I could stay for a few weeks. 6 weeks is not a lot of time. It wasn't a great experience. It ended fairly well, cordially and stuff like that. And I think the person who hired me and I had, very much made peace with like, it was just like, it wasn't the right decision for them. It wasn't the right decision for me sort of thing.
Look, I've been at companies where I was 6 weeks in and realized it was the wrong fit. And I stayed for 9 months because I didn't know I could just leave without anything lined up. I feel like in the last couple of years, that's become a little bit more normalized, especially when it's for mental health reasons or it's just not the right fit or culturally it's a toxic place or whatever. But this was a few years before all that, so I didn't have the courage to leave. And then a few stops later for me, you and I haven't talked about this, but when I went out on my own, I sent an email like that too. I still had a job, but I was getting ready to leave. My story's slightly different because I had told my CEO that eventually I was going to do this, but I didn't know when. And I did the same thing. So if there are folks that are listening to this that are thinking about leaving their full-time gig, I think the best thing that you can do is have some humility and a little bit of chutzpah and send out an email to all those people who you've made deposits to over the years and let them know what you want to do. And probably a bunch of them would love to help you. And it sounds like that's what you did. And it got you the first couple steps, a little bit of momentum. And how long ago was that at this point?
A little over 2 years ago. So I started my own thing. It was like January of 2022, like end of January 2022. Yeah, man, it's been a trip. It's been a ride. To your point too, some advice I would give is like in the short term, going back to that whole idea of you're getting paid to get an education when things are hard. In the short term, I really do believe like the hard times are magic. I've written my wins down because like it's how I sell clients. And once in a while, it's good for your mental health to remind yourself of those things. But you don't really remember those. You remember the tough stuff. And I would say my advice here, I guess, is just that like in the short term, hard times can be magic. And, in the long term, it can be unhealthy. And so you got to kind of decide what that means for you. Sometimes the short term might be 3, 4, 5, 6 months, but it's like, I don't know what that line is. Context matters. And I do think like, especially if you want to stay in startups are hard, right? Like that's really the only guarantee. And so it's really good. Like you have to appreciate hard things. And so I would say like, even though everyone kind of has those dark times, like I would embrace them. And again, you don't want to live in that situation forever. A year feels definitively too long, but like I've gone through hard times for 6, 9 months and maybe 9 was too long. I don't know, but like I built some real character and wisdom. And then there was other times like this, context matters, where it was like, 6 weeks was enough. And so I don't know what the advice there is other than like the macro, embrace them in the short term and make plans in the long term. But yeah, definitely something I feel very strongly about.
I think the takeaway for me is defining what's important to you values wise and having certain things that you're okay with flexing on and certain things that you're not okay, that are non-negotiables for you. And maybe reading between the lines and not asking you to say something that maybe you don't want to say. It sounds like in this last situation, there were some things that maybe crossed that non-negotiables line. And that's why you didn't have the bandwidth to let it ride for a little bit.
100%, right? Like I've been a part of stars for a long time where crazy shit happened. There was like a party, people were sumo wrestling, someone broke their leg. There was a burrito eating contest and an intern was forced to eat too many burritos. Like I've seen plenty of craziness, but this was different stuff. And it goes back to like the whole, you got to figure out in your career, all jobs are hard. What are you going to tolerate? What can you not live without? I think that one's super important. And then what's the stuff that's just like a hard no? And I think to your point, I didn't know the answer to this question, but I feel like you just answered it for both of us. Like whether it's 6 weeks or 9 months, it probably depends on where the spectrum you are on like the non-negotiables.
And having that list of what is important to me is the most important thing. Because otherwise it's just a feeling, right? Hey, something about this doesn't feel right, but you might not be able to put words to it. And so I think when you predefine your values, it gives you a rubric that you can cross-check the situation and say, is this one of these things? Or is there something else going on? Is it something in my personal life? Is it a work life thing? Am I just hungry? I mean, you know what I mean? It's hard to detangle feelings sometimes.
100%.
So throughout our conversation, you have mentioned the role of mentorship a few times. I'm curious to know, is there a person or maybe a moment that's had a big impact on your career trajectory?
I'll give you two answers. The first one is there's been a lot. And one of the reasons that I write a lot now. And one of the reasons I do that, and of course, I'm trying to like generate biz, but that's a short-sighted reason. Like if that's why you do something, you just won't last. I think as Ryan Holiday said, like it's not who moves the fastest, it's those who like slow down the least. I think stamina is like one of the most underrated attributes in startups. And so the first thing I would say is I've had a lot of them, and writing for me publicly, it's a way to like give back and like contribute to the internet. I write a lot about like, what's the stuff in growth I wish somebody told me 5 or 10 years ago. So the reason I do that is because like, yeah, I've had like probably 4 or 5 people who've been real springboards for my career. I'll give you a more interesting story though. It's like sort of an inflection point, like one person in particular. So when I was in management consulting, I've always been really big into like the outdoors. And, you know, this was, like I said, 2010, 2011. I had just read the 4-Hour Workweek, the Tim Ferriss book. There was like a chapter in there. I'm going to kind of butcher this, but it was like basically all about how, I forget where he went to school. I think it was like an Ivy League school, maybe Princeton or something like that. And I think he said like he took a course, or maybe he was like a guest lecturer and gave this course. But anyway, the whole idea of the course, like the one assignment was like, try to get a hold of someone who's like a hero of yours, who's like, seems like incredibly like far out there that you would like never get in touch with. And, you know, at the end of the semester, whoever had the most interesting story to tell with like proof, of course, got some ridiculously awesome prize, like a plane ticket around the world. But his whole point, the whole lesson of like the class was like, hey, these people that you look up to that you think are just really far away, everyone thinks that. So there's actually like way less people who reach out to them. So you actually like, from a conversion rate standpoint, might have a decent shot at actually talking to some of them. And there were stories in the book of like 19-year-old college kids talking to founders of Google, them getting like flown out, like crazy stuff, right? So I was like, this is cool. I'm going to do this like little self-guided version of this. And it was at that time in management consulting where I was like on the cusp of this isn't right. I was about to make a big decision. And so I'd always loved the outdoors. And so Yvonne Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia, was like a big hero of mine. And so I tried to get a hold of him for 3 months, which is like a whole other podcast episode because like he didn't have email. He didn't have a cell phone. After 3 months of trying, I was in a meeting when I was management consulting and my phone rings and I didn't think anything of it. Didn't know the number and there's voicemail on it. And so I think I check it like 2 hours later when I'm back at my desk. Sure enough, guy calls my phone. I'm sure he wouldn't remember me. We talked for like 20 minutes just about like business life, stuff like that. Yeah, so sure he wouldn't remember it, but like that was a total inflection point. And so you talk about just like a moment that sort of like changed things. That one's like a little bit less practical, but you know, I have had 4 or 5 people also who've just been wonderful mentors, and you know, I'm trying to return the favor by writing right now.
And what is it about that moment that made you share that? Was it the actual conversation in the game that he shared, or was it the journey and the feeling of achievement to get the conversation or something different?
It was kind of like when I got the job in management consulting and you were asking about that. It was just like very empowering to be like, I did this thing. I like willed this thing into existence. And I've just had a few of those experiences. Life's hard, startups are hard, of course, all the above. But when you do that, it's just like a total unlock. And you just get excited about like the possibilities, even if you don't know what they are.
Right. If I can accomplish this, I wonder if I could accomplish this.
Yeah, totally.
I didn't think I could accomplish this one thing, and I just did it. I wonder if I could accomplish this other crazy thing that might be more within reach.
Totally. And it's like compounding, eighth wonder of the world, right? And so, whether it was how I got a hold of Yvonne or other stuff, it's like I very much try to just like, can you just make a small amount of progress each day and like make sure you're focused on the right stuff? And in time, that stuff really stacks up and usually good things happen.
Mike, what's one skill that you wished you worked on earlier in your career that you didn't?
I think as it relates to growth, the hard skills always came pretty natural to me, right? Like the mathematical side of marketing, hitting a database to figure out what was broken in an onboarding flow. But the soft skills are just as important, especially as you grow into your career and might be tasked with leading some other people. And yeah, I used to think like you could kind of figure everything out with just the hard skills, and that's half of it. And the other half is the soft. And that was something I certainly learned. And I'm thankful I didn't learn it when I was 40 or 50. But yeah, it would have been helpful to learn that 5-7 years sooner for sure.
And is there a specific soft skill that comes to mind as you share that?
There's a few. I mean, a commitment to like always learning, iteration. I go back to again, compounding and just like the magic of that. And how do you build teams that don't get demoralized when you're wrong a lot, which is really what growth is. Those are big ones. Yeah, I love like the whole like management style, the radical candor stuff where it's like, you should push people, you should be hard, but like you have to earn it. And the way you earn it is by making sure they understand you see them as a person first and just putting in the upfront work to be able to push people. So yeah, I mean, there's a whole host of them. I think that the soft skills is like an ongoing education for me. I don't know if that was something that was like difficult for you, but it was definitely something that I wish I started taking serious sooner. And I didn't really understand the power law that is, hey, even if you're awesome at what you do, if you can get 10 other people to be like that good or better, it's power law. And it just makes what you can do on your own so trivial. So that's a big one. I don't know. There's probably like 30 soft skills that are important. Those are a few that come to mind.
My journey is very similar. Once I got promoted to team lead and I was responsible for leading meetings and not always coming up with the strategy in the early days, but getting other folks rallied to execute the strategy and helping them problem solve, it's a totally different thing. Every year that goes on, it seems like less and less of your job is the tactical stuff, is the executing. And more of it becomes, can I communicate clearly? Can I get folks aligned? Can I problem solve? Is it clear whose decision this is? Can I make sure the right people are informed and collaborative with on that decision? How do I give them credit for the work that has been done? All that, right? It's a totally new thing. So yeah, man, I've learned most of those the hard way by doing the wrong thing and then being like, what is the right thing? What does that look like? And how can I pick up those skills? And it's a lot of what I get to do now as a coach.
Totally. But when you do the wrong thing, Andrew, that's when you really commit it to memory, kind of goes back to like, you can read all this stuff, but sometimes you just need to like fuck up for yourself to really learn something. So I've made plenty of mistakes, but I don't necessarily regret them because like, those are the things that I've really committed to memory and really tried to like course correct on in the future. So
I like the way you described it earlier in our combo. You said, even in the tough days, I was getting paid to learn these things. And I think that's a really cool reframe or a really cool perspective that I wish I had. So thank you for that. That was really cool. For folks who are listening that want to get more and interact with you, where should we send them?
I write on LinkedIn, so you can follow me, just Mike Rome. And I write 5 days a week. Again, just stuff I wish someone was talking about, or maybe they were, but I certainly didn't find them 5 or 10 years earlier in my career. My site is just moonwater.studio. If you're a 7 or 8 figure startup looking to level up how you grow. And then the last thing is I have a newsletter. I just launched it in January. I've already got almost a couple thousand subs, and it's a different sort of newsletter. The first 30 days are almost like a course. I send like 13 emails in 30 days, and it's like the most important principles I've learned scaling startups. And then after that first 30 days, I back off a bunch and do like interviews twice a month with just interesting people in startups that I think too few are talking about. So yeah, that's just moonwater.studio/scale-MBA. So yes, any of those.
We'll put a link in the notes for this. Thanks for coming on and sharing some of your story.
Yeah, man, it's a full circle moment for me. I feel like you've been doing your own thing a little bit longer than me, and you were one of the early guys I reached out to. So it's been fun, kind of building a friendship, and yeah, an honor to be here.
Hell yeah, man. Appreciate you.
Take care, dude.
Thank you for listening to the pod. I hope that you enjoyed the episode. If you did, the biggest gift that you could give me as a small business owner and as a content creator would be a review. You know the game. You can go on to Apple Podcasts. You can go on Spotify. Leave a review. That would help me service this content to other folks who are like you. Obviously, you should subscribe to the content if you really dug it. And if there's feedback that you have for me, folks you think I should chat with, stuff that you wish I would gloss over faster, whatever it is, I'm all ears. I work in growth. You're not going to hurt my feelings. I try to collect feedback and iterate quickly. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn at Andrew Kaplan or on Twitter at @akaplan. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed the episode, and I'll see you next show.